or Bradley? What do you prefer?
Either. Usually only my wife and my mother call me Bradley when I'm in trouble, but either's good.
Yeah, you're the same as me with Alexander. It's my even to the point. This is what you'll get. Your children will take that one on, because now if I've done something, they're like, my eldest is like, Alexander. I'm like, who are you talking to? It's so you'll get that one. You'll get that one. No,
all right,
but we'll crack. Well, Brad, thank you ever so much. It's an absolute pleasure to welcome you to the International Classroom podcast. The reason why you're here is because in very short time, you are going to be venturing out to what is now, in at least, a glorious sunny place, to Dubai for the Research Ed event. There are going to be people out there that maybe haven't come across Research Ed, don't know what it's about. Just break down a little bit the purpose of your trip over here and the things that you're going to be doing.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks so much for having me on the pod. It's an absolute pleasure and privilege. Really looking forward to coming out. It's actually my first time out in the region, so looking forward to it. It's a really exciting event. I think one of the core philosophies of this conference is, how do you make evidence and research, accessible and useful and practical? So I'm really delighted to be a part of it. I'm delivering 3 different sessions. I'm delivering one on the science of learning, so what we know about memory and retrieval. I'm doing a session on the research on resilience and motivation. And then the last one, although I'm not mad about the phrase, it's the technical term in the research, talking about metacognition, which is essentially just a fancy way of saying, how do we help students reflect on their thought process and essentially become independent learners?
Yeah, I like the way I saw this came out yesterday. Actually, someone posted it on LinkedIn, and I was like, there's some really, really good sessions. And just for clarity, we were having this conversation. Unfortunately, I can't attend. I'm busy at Yas Island doing a BSME STEAM event, but I think it's, from the looks of it, it's going to be a fantastic conference, as it were. But just a little background for the listeners and the watchers from yourself. You are, if I get this right, a chartered psychologist?
Yep, that's right.
What is it that led you then into that sort of field of interest?
Yeah, so my background was actually, I used to teach in a college while I was training to be a psychologist, but I actually trained predominantly as a sports psychologist. So at the time I wanted to see if I could use psychological research basically to help footballers kick a ball better. And I did that for about a decade and I loved it. And I still do a bit of that. But essentially, teaching multimillionaires how to kick a ball better is not the most intellectually stimulating area. I just felt I could make more of an impact, more of a positive dent in the world, really, in education. I just find it frustrating that there's so much good research out there that I think can really help teachers, pretty much on every question you could possibly imagine around teaching and learning. But unfortunately, this research it's behind paywalls. It's really inaccessible. It's written in a very psych-heavy jargon. Often it's not written for educators. It's often written for other researchers. And I just felt there wasn't a very good job of this stuff filtering down to the people who need it the most. So about 12 years ago or so, I moved over to working in education and pretty much now see what I do through my company, Inner Drive. We basically see ourselves at Inner Drive as basically Google Translate for research. So can we take complex research and just make it understandable and useful and put it in the hands of people who'd benefit from it in schools?
Just of a side note, by the way, do you support a football team?
I do, but you should probably say yours first because that will decide if we're going to be friends or not in this pod, I think.
You see, I'm all right. I'm all rugby. Football I watch. Don't really support anyone though. So yeah, you can keep it. You can keep it secret if you feel like people are going to shame on you for it.
That's right. So yeah, I support Tottenham, but the majority of my work has actually been with players from either Man City or Man United. So I kind of have a range of allegiances in some form and capacity.
Okay, you keep yourself on the fence there. You'll be fine.
Yeah.
Won't talk about some of the results the other night either. It's fine.
Probably for the best.
Yeah, that's a different podcast altogether for this one. But so this is this inner drive part, I kind of like the name is. So I think now that you've kind of broken it down, is a great name for what you want to do in this concept of Google Translate. And I am probably like hundreds of thousands of other teachers out there who find exactly the same thing. People come and talk to us all the time about research evidence and cognitive science and all these things. And it's just like, well, where'd you get this research from? Where are you finding these things? It's like, how do you get hold of it? So, for you to be able to do that and offer that, first of all, it is fantastic. And for those people watching and listening, if you haven't, I would definitely recommend go and check out the Inner Drive website, because it is filled with fantastic pieces of simplified research and how to apply them in the best possible way. So from your side of things, just out of curiosity, what are some of the probably more surprising things that you find in the research that are having implications on how students learn?
Yeah, so well, thank you for the kind words, by the way, about the site. We try and get as much stuff as we can out there for free. So it's nice to know that it lands well. The biggest thing, I think it used to surprise me a lot. I think now I'm a bit more kind of used to it. But just consistently in the research, you kind of keep finding how bad people are at predicting what good learning looks like. Just like there's this huge difference between what people prefer and what they like, as opposed to what's actually best for them. So the kind of comparison that I always come up with is like my 6-year-old kid, like he likes chocolate chip cookies for breakfast. Like that's definitely his preference. Yeah. But as someone slightly kind of older and wiser, I know that's not what's best for him. And I think the same thing happens in learning as well. So you look at, should students revise whilst listening to music? How much sleep do you need? Yeah. What revision strategies are the most effective? The ones they tend to go for, their answers tend to almost be the opposite of what the research finds is most beneficial. And then it becomes really interesting, because then you have to get into the psychology of, well, how do I convince them of this? And how do I get people to self-select the most beneficial strategy when it doesn't come naturally or intuitively to them? So I think that's a really interesting area in terms of cognitive science and science of learning.
We're going to pause. I want to pause on that one for the moment, because obviously we are a couple of weeks away from going off on study leave. We've got GCSEs, A levels. I think the IB exams have near enough started out here as well and around the world. Picking on some of those things that parents might be listening, teachers might be listening and watching as well. It's like when we're thinking about the music side of things and study, when we're thinking about sleep or revision strategies, if you're offering some advice then to maybe parents who are pulling their hair out a little bit, or with teachers that want to offer that best part of advice for students, what would be the information that you would give to them at this moment in time?
Okay, so in terms of study strategies, it's best really to think about it in terms of general principles. Because if you understand the principle, I think the strategies almost become obvious. So the number one principle that I think that helps learning is like, the harder you think about something, the more likely you are to remember it. And so then the question becomes, what activities prompt students to do the hard thinking, and which activities can you do without having to think hard? Now, the ones you can do without having to think hard, typically rereading, because I can just skim read. We've all, I think, had it where you've been reading for ages and you go, I've turned the pages loads in the last 5 minutes, but I actually can't remember anything I've actually read. So you can kind of do it on autopilot. Highlighting or copying your notes tends to be a really, really popular one. And again, it gives this illusion of learning. It's like, look how many colors I've highlighted, and look how many sections or notes I've copied out. But you don't actually have to really think hard to do that activity. And the activities that we know you do have to think hard on, the number one typically that gets mentioned in the research, things like retrieval practice. So essentially quizzing, be it flashcards, past papers, even verbal Q&A between students and parents. You have to think hard to answer questions. Things like spacing, so revisiting material, because you might forget it. So therefore, it's not a case of you just learn it once and then it's kind of locked away. And if you start seeing that lens of what are the things that make me have to think hard, that's the way I should revise, not the stuff that's easy or fun, which again is why it's difficult, because most people self-select easy and fun stuff because learning is difficult.
Yeah. And what about the music side of things? Should they be listening to music or not?
It drives me mad because I reckon, so we're in the drive, we do student workshops. So we go into schools, either online or in person, we do student workshops. And we always ask them, do you study, listen to music? And anecdotally, I see about 70 or 80% of students would say, not only do they study, listen to music, they will insist that it's better for them. And what they really mean is they prefer it. And yet the research is pretty conclusive. If music has lyrics, whether you like those lyrics or not, so whether it's your favorite song or a song you don't like, if it has lyrics, it negatively impacts on your learning, because essentially the lyrics get in your head, whereas I want your revision and your learning to get into your head. Now, there are some caveats. We know some students, there's been 1 or 2 tentative studies, for example, I think with ADHD, that found white noise or background noise could be beneficial. But as a rough rule of thumb, I would strongly suggest music that has lyrics isn't helpful. Now, the argument that people sometimes say about that is they go, okay, but like at the gym, music on the treadmill helps me run faster. And that's because essentially you don't have to think hard. It's quite an automatic thing you're doing, is that running. Yeah. But anytime you have to think hard, or where it's complex information and you need to think, we know music distracts and hinders.
Yeah, I've been telling my students that like all the time. I did read was it an interesting one that said about the white noise? You said that about the white noise to increase something like productivity or attention. I found that quite fascinating. And I said it to my students, and a few of them went away and just had, even if it was just their earpods in, with nothing playing through it, but it's like noise cancelling a little bit. So you hear it's like, yeah, they've come back and said positive things about it.
And the interesting thing for me is with psychology is you get massive individual differences. So, there is no one rule that works for everyone. You're talking about in general trends, best bets, and out of 100, what would work for most. So you do always get these variation. But generally speaking, there's been some research around personality types, like introverts versus extroverts, and who benefits or suffers more from music. But yeah, certainly as a rough rule of thumb, I'd strongly avoid it.
So thinking about now things that are going to benefit teachers, in terms of, we hear a lot in teachers, we're spoken at a lot about cognitive science. We see it a lot if people are on Twitter, if they're on LinkedIn, if they're on those professional learning networks. They are terms that are used a lot, or it's a word that's used a lot, but sometimes I think it's often misunderstood. Like, for you as a leader in this sense, could you simplify for us what cognitive science is?
Yeah. So I think it is easy to get confused by it because it can sound a bit jargony and technical phrases. So one of the basic tenets of cognitive science, which is all about information processing and memory, is what I think most people will accept as fairly obvious. But when you think about it in detail, the implications are quite wide varying. So the key tenet is that working memory is really small. Like, it's really easy to overload working memory being when new information is held and processed. And yet we know long-term memory is really big. Like, there's stuff kicking around in the back of your brain that you probably haven't thought about in decades, but your favorite song as a teenager, or a TV program you remember watching as a child. Like, it's huge, your long-term memory and that stuff there. And so then the challenge is, how do I help get stuff from working memory? Like, take this pod as an example. We'll talk today. I can get stuff in your working memory by just saying words. But how do I help get it into your long-term memory so that in a week or a month's time, you're going to remember it? So a lot of cognitive science is all about, how do I help facilitate that transfer from working memory to long-term memory? And there are a number of different theories and strategies based on that. Some of it is how we present information to students. So, for example, I don't know if this is the predominant method out in Dubai, but certainly here in the UK, PowerPoint is not a great tool in terms of how people use it often for teaching and learning, especially when there's loads of information on the screen or there's loads of animation. The famous phrase, if you throw enough stuff, hopefully something will stick. That's the opposite of how memory and learning works. Like, you throw too much stuff and nothing sticks. So it's about working out what's the important information. How do I signal that to students? How do I facilitate that transfer to long-term memory? How do I minimize distractions? And that's pretty much at the core of cognitive science, which I think most people would say is fairly obvious and fairly common sense. What the research is now looking at is, what are the best ways to help facilitate that.
Which nicely leads on to then the next question. You're going to get you basically to answer your own question there. What are some of the best ways that you've come across for teachers to be able to weave this into their daily practice?
Yeah. So I think one of the things that's quite important, I think, to know is a lot of cognitive science is based around how much prior knowledge your students have. So essentially, if your students don't have much prior knowledge on a topic, essentially their schema, which is just the technical way of saying how much they know and how those ideas connect, they don't have much of a framework for a topic if they're new to it. And therefore, the research is pretty clear that things like direct instructions, providing examples, doing it in small steps tends to be more beneficial for novices because they don't have that framework, so we need to provide it for them. I want their working memory not scrambling to remember the question. I want their working memory free to be able to solve it based on the structure that I provide them. Whereas experts, or those who know a lot about a topic, because their schema is more nuanced, it's richer and more complex, essentially they don't need as much direct instruction. You could probably set them more independent tasks. And this is really interesting, right? Because it's actually quite counterintuitive. Because what I actually suggest is to develop independent learners, which is really important. You don't do it by just giving people more independent tasks. If I give a novice an independent task, if I ask you to do a task that you've never done before, you don't really know much about the topic, it's overwhelming and you don't know where to begin. So actually, the way we develop independent learners in part is actually by building up that knowledge step by step. And so being very clear with this direct instruction at the start and then scaffolding and reducing that scaffold as people get better, I think is a really key part, because then you start to look at, well, how many tasks do we give students that are actually fairly independent? You kind of go like, here's a project or here's something to go search on the internet for. But unless you have much prior knowledge, you don't really know where to begin. And so I think that's a really interesting area to look at. How does that vary over time between novices and experts?
Yeah, I was having a conversation with someone previously this week, actually, and we were talking about sort of educators and, let's say, the topics that you don't want to teach. So I'm a scientist and my degree is in human biology. But the lady who I work with, she's got a PhD in biochemistry. So when it comes to A-level science, I'm like, look, you choose your topics you want to teach, and it's generally the ones that kids really enjoy. Well, I'll take the biochemistry, I'll take the respiration, photosynthesis. So I am left with ecosystems and conservation, which when you say this to kids in biology terms, like, that stuff. And it was interesting because we were talking about being, facilitators on the side or sage on the stage. And he said, now what you do, and I've done this, I'm guilty of it, is it's with a topic that I don't enjoy, or don't have the deep contextual knowledge of, it's easy for me to facilitate. I can create loads of great resources. I can look at I use OneNote. I can look at my OneNote and go, look at all these resources to push kids off to be independent learners. They're doing it by themselves. But it's because I don't have, I'm not interested really in some of it, but because of that, I don't have that deep knowledge, content knowledge, to be able to guide them through and answer the questions. So I'm there thinking, I'm doing really good. The kids are off being independent learners. They're collaborating, doing this. Whereas actually, from what you're saying is, I'm probably doing them a disservice, because they don't have that framework of knowledge being built up over time to then be able to approach those topics successfully.
Yeah, and it's really alluring to kind of think that I'm setting lots of independent work. We talk about modern, in inverted commas, modern skills like collaboration and creativity. But it's very hard to do those things if you don't have any knowledge of the thing that you're trying to be creative with. Like my favorite example of this is, I don't know if you've ever seen the film, it's quite an old film, Apollo 13. So basically when the guys go up into space and it all goes wrong, right? There's a brilliant scene in it where something goes wrong in the rocket in space, and the NASA engineers on the ground, they replicate that problem and they go, this is the tools, that's what these guys have in their spaceship. How can we tell them to solve the problems with these tools, right? And it's seen as this amazing form of like creativity and teamwork and collaboration and independent thinking. But they can only do that because they are experts in rocket science. Like, I can't do that even if I'm really creative and I've got really good team skills and problem solving skills if I don't have that knowledge. I think that's quite a good example of like, yes, it's a good thing to aim for, but we have to build it up. We can't just, it's not like sink or swim where you can just throw people into the deep end and hope that it kind of works.
Yeah, definitely. It kind of leans thinking about this, and obviously touched on this idea of exams and assessments. And obviously assessment at the moment is going through, obviously, is a hot topic of conversation with lots of educators out there and consultants out there. But just from a side, look, just from thinking of obviously what we've just said about knowledge and obviously the development of, just want to move over to things like project-based learning. Because again, I've seen a few things about this, and I've spoken with a few different people. It's like, based on what we're saying then about then this development of knowledge and obviously giving those opportunities, as it were, for those things, what's your take on project-based learning, and being able to integrate and develop, one is knowledge or learning, and secondly, those skills?
Yeah. I'm not anti it per se. I always just worry of how does stuff get divided up. So let's say if it's part of a group project for a start, that it's not dominated or monopolized by the loudest, the quickest. Because essentially, if we go back to that early idea of cognitive science being like, I want everyone thinking hard. Whoever does the hard thinking is probably doing the learning. And the problem with project-based learning is, in part, unless I have a clear structure, I can't ensure that everyone's doing hard thinking, essentially. If you do have a good structure and you have checks in place, then that's a good thing. So that's why I'm not anti it per se. But the other, I guess, problem with project-based learning. Okay, so here's the reason why I generally prefer exams as a form of assessment. Is I think any form of assessment has got to try and reduce bias and privilege, essentially. And you look at exams and they're externally set, students essentially take them anonymously, and they're externally marked. So you have some checks in place to ensure that people can't game the system as much. And of course, that people can get tutors as well. But stuff like coursework or project-based learning, it does inherently favour either those with high prior knowledge or those with means and privilege, because you can get more support. Some people can get more support when they're at home than others. And that's before you've even got into areas like AI and ChatGPT, which I think now make that stuff a bit of a nightmare. So I actually think moving forward, we're going to see a move even further towards traditional assessment, because I need to be able to check that you've actually done the work. And the problem now with AI and project-based learning is students might use AI as a shortcut, and it kind of gives them an output, but it's the process of doing the hard thinking and mentally wrestling with the information. That's where the learning happens. And I'm worried that might not happen as much if people delegate it to AI.
Based on that, do you think then this integration, because I think it's one of the challenges now that's kind of facing teachers and definitely facing students in the world they're in and going to move into, do you think AI and the implementation of this technology, is it going to have an impact, be it positive, negative, on student learning?
Yeah, I think unless students are given very clear structure by their parents and schools, I think there's scope that it can really hinder learning. AI is confident but often wrong, which is not a great basis for learning. I think the polite way they describe it is hallucinations, which is just a polite way of saying, yeah, that's just good marketing, a bit of like, we're going to get stuff wrong. But it says it very confidently. And what's interesting, so let's take you as a science teacher. If you put something into AI or ChatGPT, because you have high prior knowledge of biology, you can spot those hallucinations really easy. You can go, well, there's no way that's right, because I know that's not the case of whatever the topic is. But if you don't have high prior knowledge, if you've got low prior knowledge and you're just taking AI at face value, then students don't know what's a hallucination and what's not. And so I actually think it's going to be a really valuable tool in the short term for teachers. I think helping you set up a quiz, helping you plan a lesson, having variation in some of the activities, basically using it as a way of brainstorming. I think can be really valuable for teachers because you're more of an expert in your domain, so you're able to pick and choose which bits are good or not. Whereas for students, as I say, because they don't have that domain knowledge yet, they can't trust AI to know what's hallucination, what's not. I think that is problematic.
Yeah. Let's think then about, obviously, you've got a field of expertise within cognitive science and psychology and understanding this. And for me, who's an absolute, let's just say, novice in this area, do you think it would benefit or could benefit me as an educator if I was like, well, I heard Brad talking about, retrieval practice and spacing. I'm going to give AI my content knowledge about biology, let's say photosynthesis, and I'm going to ask it to generate retrieval practice, or I'm going to give it a topic for spacing and interleaving. Do you see it being beneficial in a pedagogical way for educators in that respect?
I think it definitely will be. And this is an interesting thing for me in terms of research. So a research paper takes anywhere between 12 to 18 months to get published. So all the research we have on AI at the moment, it's already dated because the speed of advancement is so fast. So demand and interest is outpacing good research on it. So we don't really know, yes, but I have seen a number of teachers. So for example, just this week, I was talking to a French teacher and they're basically saying they just wanted a range of vocabulary quizzes because they don't want to ask the same one each time. They want a few different starter activities that can reinforce prior learning, but just doesn't feel monotonous. And by putting in the right prompts, ChatGPT could generate that for them. There is some emerging evidence that it can be beneficial in things like retrieval and spacing. But it's one of those things of, we use the phrase, I don't know if you've ever heard the phrase GIGO. GIGO, which stands for garbage in, garbage out. So basically garbage in, garbage out.
I've heard that one, yeah.
So if you feed it rubbish, you'll get rubbish back. And so most people who I think have struggled with AI at this stage, they go, I asked it to do X, but it wasn't very good what it came out with. Whereas when you actually start digging some of the research and even just stuff on Google around what makes a good prompt, by feeding a higher quality prompt, you do get better stuff back. And I'm sure in 3 years' time, it'll be second nature and be light years ahead of what we're actually doing at the moment.
What's interesting with that, and from my viewpoint on it then, is that educators, teachers, to actually get this idea of good learning, or even just a case of the hard thinking that you mentioned, teachers need the understanding of, pedagogy, content or technology, and understanding all these things that we've talked about. Do you think, and I'm just thinking back to my own university days and doing my own PGCE, but do you think enough time and emphasis is spent educating educators on the techniques and on the I suppose, just the good characteristics we've mentioned of how to build these things into lessons? Or do you think there's a shortfall in there?
Yeah. I'm going to sit on the fence and give a yes and a no type answer. So the first answer I'd say is no, there's nowhere near enough. Because if you ask most people about their training and go, what did you learn? What were you taught about learning and memory? Most people would often say not much at all, if anything. And I think in hindsight, it sounds mad that that's the case, because I actually don't believe you can do good teaching without a good understanding of what learning looks like. So I don't think there's anywhere near enough. But the other side of that is I think things are getting much better. I talk to teachers now who've just recently finished their training, and their understanding of cognitive science is far better compared to what they would have experienced 5 or even 10 years ago. And I actually think we're in a bit of a golden age of research, because there is so much good research being released, and you get these more and more people like us, but not just us, who blog about this sort of stuff, who kind of put it out there and translate that research. I think it is getting so much better. Now, on one hand, I actually feel quite sorry for teachers, because, well, you're expected to be an expert of biology, you're expected to be an expert on child development, and you're expected to be an expert on cognitive science and pedagogy, or to be able to do your job. And well, that's a lot, given that no one has any time. Like lots of people think that, there's a lot to cover in my lessons in the curriculum, and therefore I just don't have time for this sort of stuff. So it is a legitimate challenge and worry, but I'm excited about the travel of direction.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I did my PGC 2005, 2006, and it's only
no way. You don't look old. You don't look old enough. You don't look old enough to have done your PGC 20 years ago. Surely not.
I turned 40 in February. But mine was the same. I came out here, I came out to Dubai in 2015, and there's people talking about things. I'm going, I'd never heard of Rosenshine's principles. Which saying this now, or any of these, cognitive science, what is this? And and maybe the age of social media helped in terms of pushing that out. Yeah. But I completely agree with you. I think there's so much more of it, but I think it's still then my side of it is about going back to this idea of educating educators. So if we were thinking about educational research or action research, we choose to obviously two sides of it from there. If you were offering a piece of advice to teachers in terms of we want to do some of this in school, we want to find out how we can obviously find research papers and go about simplifying it, apart from saying to them, hey, come over to InnoDrive. Apart from that, what would you recommend to them to kind of be? What would you be recommending to them in terms of steps they could be doing to get themselves started within their school?
Yeah. So I think, what do I think? I think reading research can sometimes be overwhelming to start with, and it's quite inaccessible. So I don't think people need to jump straight to that. There is a wealth of books and blogs on this sort of area. And the reason I quite I've in the last 5 years, I don't think you've ever seen as many teachers blogging about this sort of stuff, which is really nice because you see it through a lens of how they've used it and how practical it is. And that's really good. And I think that's one of these things. It's just like anything. The more you read, I think you go through various phases. You read a bit and you go, that makes perfect sense. It's a light bulb moment. It's simple. I'm going to do X or Y. And then actually you go through a bit of a dip of you read a bit more and you kind of go, oh, I can see how this stuff's all connected to each other. So for example, if you take stuff like Rosenshine, how is that connected to retrieval practice? How is that linked to cognitive load theory? You can see how these various aspects interlink. But then you go through a stage of going, the more you read, you realize the contradictions or the nuances. And then it actually leads to a bit of questioning and self-doubt, which I think is really healthy for the profession. I think education is very prone to cycles and fads and just wholesale adoption of things, whereas reading the stuff with a critical lens and thinking of the benefits but also limitations, that's really valuable. And I think the final thing I'd kind of say is once you've read all that stuff is you don't need permission to start doing it. If you read some really good stuff on retrieval practice, you can start doing retrieval practice activities in your lesson tomorrow, and you don't need permission to wait. And I think, one thing that's quite nice about, there's many challenges in teaching, but one of the nice things is it's your classroom and it's your domain. And so therefore, if you want to do something that you believe is in the best interest of your students, you should explore what that looks like.
That's a great piece of advice. I think because that's always the challenge we see in terms of people have this great recall knowledge that they can talk to you about it, talk about it. I've read this. And the next part you go to is great. What does that look like? And they're like, I've not. And I think that sometimes is a hurdle for a lot of educators to get over is I've read this. I'm not sure actually how to implement it. I'm not sure what it looks like in the classroom. What advice would you be giving to people? It's all good to say, let's just start it. So let's just stick with, one of the retrieval practices. How would you advise someone to actually, go and start implementing it and actually doing it? What would be the steps that they can use to get over that obstacle?
Yeah. So if anyone's not sure how to implement anything they read from research, again, I think that's a good thing. That's an opportunity, because the interesting thing about being evidence informed is you're not looking to replicate a study in your classroom. That research is done on different students, probably of a different age, maybe even from a different country. So you're not looking to go, how do I do exactly what this research paper says? You're looking for the general principle for me. So if the principle is that students who do regular retrieval, who think hard, remember more, if the research paper did 5 retrieval questions at the start of every lesson, but you go, I don't have time to do 5, then don't do 5. Like, do 1, do 3. You can adapt it. Research is not like it's not an instruction manual. It's not a step-by-step guide. It's basically, someone recently described it to me as, it's a compass, right? It can point you in a direction, but it's not GPS. Like, it's not going to give you the exact coordinates of where you need to go and what you need to do. And I know that can seem overwhelming for some people because they go, I don't know what this looks like in the classroom. I'd actually challenge them and try and reframe it and go, that's liberating, because we need your expertise as teachers. Like, you know your subject and you know your students far better than any research paper ever will. So if you can take the key principles from the research, but apply it in your context as you see fit, don't worry about it being perfect or exactly what one particular study says. Actually, I want you to go experiment. I want you to do a bit of trial and error within these parameters of research principles. And so I don't know, for example, I can't tell you what retrieval practice should look like for your biology lesson because I don't know enough about biology. But I can tell you the general findings from research and give you space and trust you to think about, well, here's how I think it could apply. And that's a good thing. Cognitive science is meant to liberate teachers. It's not meant to handcuff them into worry about exactly how do I replicate that study.
Again, I think that's absolutely great. I come across so many educators and I've watched so many lessons, and when you speak to people, it's always like, well, it's got to be done this way and it has to be exactly like this. And that they're missing the point in terms of, but research is about what happens in your classroom. And it's like, there's evidence that supports this. There's a great case study that, it supports using these methods. But what that looks like, go back to that, what good learning looks like in your classroom. It has to be individual for the teacher and to that class. So I think that's an absolute great piece of advice. The follow-up question I have for that then, and I think this is something that's often overlooked for educators, is going back to the posh word of metacognition. But for teachers then that are using these and doing it, how do they then go about reflecting and actually thinking about, was this successful, what not? I think the evaluation part is often, I think, completely overlooked for educators, where they don't get time to reflect and stop and go, did that work for me? How do I change this? What would I do differently? Like, what would be your advice, in terms of how they can approach those things of saying, well, I've read it, I've done it, now what?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question because there isn't an easy answer. For the simple reason is you'll never know what the alternative would have been. So you do X with your students, it leads to Y results. I will never know what would have happened if I didn't do X. I'm always going to be guessing. So working out what works is really tricky. I think so. I read a research paper that describes when you reflect, you should think about it in terms of there's 3 voices this research paper framed it as in terms of decision-making and self-evaluation. So the first voice they say is the research. Like, what does this research paper, what's the general findings from research say about retrieval practice and if that was a good bet or not? The second voice is your own experience. So in the past, Alex, when you've done X, what happened? And when you've done Y, what happened? Because I do want to tap into your 20 plus years of teaching because that's really valuable. And then the third voice is that of your colleagues. It's much easier to offer advice and critique when we're the third person, when it's someone else, as opposed to reflecting on our own, because we've got our own biases and own lens that we see things. And so that sort of triangulation of the research voice, your own voice, and your colleague's voice, I actually think is pretty powerful. It's not perfect, because we're never going to know. Like, it's really hard essentially to conduct a randomized control trial in your own classroom. Like, it's pretty much impossible. And probably not desirable either. But I think those 3, placing weight and value on those 3 different perspectives, I think is probably a good starting point.
Fantastic. So we've got people out here. We mentioned, obviously, we've got so many educators now who are blogging and who are unpacking these ideas. And there's probably people out there as well that are listening to this that are interested and want to get started, have read certain books. Like, if you were to give, your top either websites or journals to be reading, of places they can go if they're happy to pay, but they could go to and go, I can get my hands on research and I can utilize this. Where would you recommend for educators or people interested to go and start, obviously, whether it's paying or not, but using and finding, obviously, these articles and journals to read?
Yeah. So the first thing I'd say is if you want to read research directly, but you find you can't because it's behind a paywall, I'm yet actually to meet a researcher who, if you email them and ask them for a copy of their study, won't email it to you for free themselves. And it's really easy to find their email addresses. It's on every university website, basically. And I'm a big believer of if you don't ask, you don't get. So I think that's a good starting point. I'd be remiss not to say we're in a drive. We have a weekly newsletter that every time we find a new study, we summarize it and send that out. I know of another educator who does a brilliant newsletter in terms of sending research summaries out, a guy called Peps McRae, and his is called Evidence Snacks, which I think is brilliant 5 minutes summary of research. So I think those are the sort of places. If anyone's looking for a book to read, obviously my publisher would kill me if I didn't mention our book, The Science of Learning, or our other one, Teaching and Learning Illuminated. I think another brilliant book by a teacher called Jade Pierce, which is called What Every Teacher Needs to Know, might be one of the most thorough summaries. There's another really great book by a trio of guys called Carl Hendrick, Paul Kirshner, and Jim Hill, called How Learning Happens, which I think is brilliant. Yeah. And I think those sort of books like Jade's or that other one give an intro. They can point you in the direction of what research to read. It can give you a brief summary and act as a bit of a gateway for people then at the start of their journey.
Yeah, fantastic. Great recommendations. We've got some of those. I think most schools now seem to have this kind of PD library where they've got these books and repertoires of things in, and near enough most of the ones I've been to, I know in our school we've got those as well. So yeah, absolute great recommendations there. Just starting to wrap this up then for us. I'm just interested, I've got kind of two remaining questions for you, but one would be in terms of sort of the evolution of cognitive science, in terms of where we stand now and looking ahead over the next decade. How do you think it's going to evolve and change in these next 10 years?
Yeah, so I think the big battle about 10 years ago was to look at what learning strategies are likely to be most beneficial. So 10 years ago, you saw lots of studies comparing retrieval practice to just rereading, or sort of this spacing versus cramming. Whereas I think that argument's been largely kind of put to bed now. I expect in the next 10 years, we're going to get much more nuance on the application. So, right, we say retrieval practice is great. What does the research say about when we should use retrieval practice? What does the research say about different types of retrieval practice questions? And I think we're going to get much more into the nitty gritty and the details, which is actually going to aid how we deliver this stuff, as opposed to just what works. We actually look at how and why it works a bit more, I think. I think we're in that stage, aren't we, in terms of everyone's doing it, everyone is kind of delivering, and obviously at that point of, right, why does this work and how does it work, and are there better ways to do it? That's exciting. I think it's exciting for people in the educational field who are passionate about those types of things. And talking about that in terms of wrapping this up, it's clear to listen to you, and if anyone's ever watched any of your videos as well, or listened to you speak, it's this type of area is something you're massively passionate about and hugely knowledgeable about as well. In your time with Inner Drive, what have you found to be probably the most rewarding thing that you've done that kind of helps to keep you motivated and going with this? Yeah. Well, thank you for the compliment. I don't know how much of an expert I am. I just read lots of other people's stuff, but I'll take the compliment. I think the nicest thing that I see is we get emails from teachers around the world who consistently tell us, having read that study or your summary of that study, I decided to try and do X, and here's what I found. We see that a lot for stuff like retrieval. We see it a lot when we talk, we haven't talked about it too much today, but the research around mobile phones or sleep, which I think there's a real issue on both those for students.
Oh, yeah.
And just hearing people say, it's informed their practice. I think most people hate any form of professional development if they find it patronizing, or if they feel that they're being told what you're doing wasn't good enough, don't do that, do this. Whereas I think, as I say, I think people, they come alive a bit when they hear about cognitive science, when they get the chance to apply it to their practice, as opposed to being told what to do. And just getting those emails from schools around the world who says it's just really informed their judgment and developed their self-reflection, that's just what makes it worthwhile.
Oh, it's amazing. And I think it's evidence for the quality of the work that you guys do. And as I say, so much of it there for free for educators to benefit from. And we all know the trickle down effect of that in terms of you improve the educators themselves, we're going to improve the students and the impact it has on them. So, I highly, highly recommend people out there, if you're interested, obviously you've made some wonderful recommendations today, Brad, with the books, but go check out Inner Drive, innerdrive.co.uk.
Spot on.
Spot on. There we go. And we'll put all the links obviously in the descriptions below. But for now, Brad, it's been an absolute pleasure. I've been super, super looking forward to speaking to you all week about this, by the way. And I'm gutted that I'm not going to be able to be at the Research Ed event next week. But I am, anyone who's going and gets the opportunity to listen to you and some of the other fantastic speakers there is going to leave, I'm sure, with a wealth of knowledge. So safe travels. Enjoy Dubai. And thank you again once so much for coming on to speak to me today.
Oh, well, thank you for the invite and for everything you do. And yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure.